Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Okay, good morning, everybody. Okay, so this is the first day in a new course. So we're following only 2 weeks after the previous course ended. But now we're graduating from Buddha Studies 101. Now we're in something like, what would it be in a university? 201? 103? I don't know how to number. Okay, so now we're going to be working through selected discourses in the Majjhima Nikāya. This is the middle-length collection of the Buddha's discourses. And one thing I should say about, I had prepared a schedule which I think might have been sent to those who had registered for the course, and it's up on the BAO's website. But I realized that I was too idealistic in formulating that schedule. I formulated it with the idea that I would just spend one class per sutta, or that this one sutta would be covered in one class. But that's not my way of teaching. I don't try to rush through a sutta, but I like to explain in detail. So I'm sure that by class number 2, the schedule is going to be thrown off, and it's going to go probably at a much more leisurely and stately pace than the schedule will indicate. So don't take the schedule seriously, but just try to keep track of what sutta we're covering each week based on what we end on the previous week. Okay, so we'll be using as the basis for study the Majjhima Nikāya. And there's a reason why I always like to begin with the Majjhima Nikāya. As you may know from the previous class, there are 4 Nikayas, which are the foundational texts of early Buddhism. These are the Bhikkhu Nikaya, Okay, these are the Bhikkhu Nikāya, which is the collection of long discourses of the Buddha. Then the Majjhima Nikāya, the collection of middle-length discourses. The Samyutta Nikāya, which is what I translate as the collection of connected discourses. And this is a collection which groups together suttas according to theme. So it's arranged into some 56 chapters. Each of these chapters is called a Samyutta, which means connected, because it connects together or joins together suttas, short suttas dealing with a common theme. So we have chapters on the 5 aggregates, chapters on dependent origination, chapters on the 6 sense bases, chapter on feeling, chapter on the Noble Eightfold Path, the 4 foundations of mindfulness, 7 enlightenment factors, and so on. Then the Anguttara Nikāya, it means literally increasing by a factor, and it's also called in the commentaries the Ekottara or Ekuttara Nikāya, which means increasing by 1. And this is a collection which is arranged numerically. The Buddha often gave his discourses based upon a numerical scheme, a set of 3 factors, 4 factors, 5 factors. And so the Anguttara Nikaya collects together the suttas which are organized around a specific number of factors. So we have all of the suttas dealing with 1s, great number of suttas dealing with 2s, number of suttas dealing with 3s, all the ways up to suttas dealing with 11 items, framed in terms of 11 items. Now it seems to me that even though if we just judge by the names and modes of arrangement themselves, it seems that the principle that underlies the collection of these 4 Nikayas is simply a matter of size or principle of organization. So long discourses, middle discourses, short discourses organized around themes, short discourses organized around the numerical scheme. But it seems to me that if we really look so deeply and conscientiously through the actual content of these Nikayas, we can see that as a general principle, there is some other purpose underlying this particular scheme of organization. And so the impression that I get is that the long discourses have largely what I would call a propagational function. We could even say a pedagogical function. That their purpose is to promote the Buddha's teaching within the context of the contemporary Indian social, cultural, and religious worlds in which Buddhism arose. Are you trying to get?
Yeah, there's sound problem. They cannot hear the sound, so I'm trying to fix it. It's because of the rap.
Oh, okay. Okay, so we see, for example, in the Digha Nikaya, there are a number of suttas in which the Buddha is debating with Brahmins about the validity of the class system of that period. Whether social class should be determined by birth or by virtue of personal qualities. There are suttas which glorify the Buddha above the deities of the period. For example, we have one sutta in which Sakka, the god Sakka, who is virtually the same as the Veda god Indra, approaches the Buddha, asks questions, and declares himself a disciple of the Buddha. Then we have sutta like the Brahmajala Sutta, in which the Buddha propounds 62 views of the period and then criticizes those views. Samanyapala Sutta, the second sutta in which the Buddha exalts the goals or the benefits that come from leading the life of renunciation. And then, of course, there's the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, which is a long composite sutta dealing with the last days of the Buddha. And so this has quite an emotional impact upon those who, in the original period, would have heard it, and later those who read it. In the Digha Nikaya, however, apart from a few suttas, like the Mahasatipatthana Sutta, Mahanidana Sutta, we don't find so many discourses dealing what I would call the core teachings of early Buddhism. For this, the collection which best presents these types of teachings, in my opinion, is the Majjhima Nikāya. The Majjhima Nikāya has the double advantage of compressing what I would call the greatest variety of teachings into one collection, the greatest variety of fundamental collections, the greatest variety of fundamental teachings. It compresses into one collection, and it displays these teachings in a wide variety of different scenarios which can arouse the interest of the listener or the reader. And so there's a certain amount of narrative, dramatic content, and then also a wide variety of very fundamental, important, essential teachings, both in terms of doctrine and in terms of practice. And so it seems to me that whereas the Digha Nikāya was directed primarily outwardly to those living within the Indian society, those imbued with Indian culture, is that coming from the computer or? Okay, so whereas the Digha Nikāya seems to be directed outwardly to the people in the Indian society, Indian culture, the Majjhima Nikāya is directed inwardly towards the Buddhist community. Is there some way to get rid of that sound? If it's coming from this, then we just... We could use the other microphone. Sorry for the technical difficulties. So the Majjhima Nikāya seems to be directed inwardly towards the Buddhist community. And the way I see it, that its primary purpose is to acquaint first newly ordained monks and perhaps newly converted or newly I think we just turn this off and use the other microphone. Okay, there's a stand for that. Okay, I'll continue to speak with this. Okay. I think there might be a way too wide. It would have to be tightened. Okay, I'll hold it like this. Okay. Okay, so the Majjhima Nikāya, it seems to me, has the purpose of acquainting newly ordained monastics as well as lay people who have newly embraced the Buddha Dharma with the fundamental teachings and practices of Buddhism. Then the Samyutta Nikāya seems to me to be intended primarily for specialists, those who become more specialized in the specific teachings of early Buddhism. So those who want to gain an extensive knowledge and understanding of these main themes on the five aggregates, dependent origination, the sense bases, and so on. And also for those who are engaged in the practice of intensive insight meditation, because the discourses on the aggregates, sense bases, dependent arising, Four Noble Truths deal with the themes or material that is to be contemplated in order to gain insight. And then it seems to me that the Anguttara Nikāya serves the very practical purpose of providing teachers, lecturers with material for discourses, for preaching. If any of you have ever given Dhamma lectures, you know how convenient it is to have a scheme, a numerical scheme, so that you might have 6 items, 7 items, 8 items. You don't have to worry very much about what you're going to speak on at length, but you just have this list of 6, 7, 8 items, maybe on a little slip of paper in front of you, and then you can just formulate the discourse around this little list of items. And so, if we look at these suttas in the Anguttara Nikāya, we see that a lot of them are concerned with monastic themes, different aspects of the monastic training. And so those suttas were probably intended for elder monks or elder nuns who had the purpose, who had the function, the responsibility for teaching younger monastics. But in the Anguttara Nikāya, we also find a lot of suttas dealing with aspects of lay life. So it occurred to me that the Anguttara Nikāya would have also provided material for monks who were charged with giving discourses, with schemes and outlines to use when expounding the Dhamma to lay people, and showing how these principles of the Buddha's teaching could be applied to their day-to-day life. So we have discourses on right livelihood, discourses on the responsibility of children to their parents, parents to children, husbands and wives to one another, and so on. Okay, so we will be taking as the basis for our study the middle-length discourses, which is, as I said, it's the collection that, in my opinion, brings together the richest variety of teachings with the most interesting dramatic scenarios and diversity of scenes. And the first discourse that I'll be taking is called the Sabbāsava Sutta. This is discourse number 2 in the Majjhima Nikāya. People sometimes ask, why don't you begin with sutta number 1? Well, to give one example why I don't begin with discourse number 1, I have one student, her name is Kim, she lives in Colorado, She was always saying to me, I want to study Pali, I want to study Pali, I want to study Pali. So then she came to this area, and she was staying at Huangyan Monastery for a few days, and she asked to sit in on my Pali class on the Mula Pariyaya Sutta, the first sutta of the Majjhima Nikāya. She sat in on the class, and when we walked out of the class, she said, I think I don't really have to learn Pali. It's enough if I know the main doctrinal terms. So the first discourse in the Majjhima Nikāya is very difficult, and to understand it properly, one has to have gone through, in my opinion, one has to have gone through the whole Majjhima Nikāya, had many of the suttas explained at length, and then one comes back to the first sutta, and one can begin to understand it. Otherwise, it's just like a series of riddles. Okay, so we will begin with sutta number 2. This is called the Sabbāsava Sutta, which is the sutta on all. I don't really like so much the word taints. This was Venerable Nyanamoli's choice of this word. And so I decided just to adhere to Venerable Nyanamoli's terminology, but I'm not particularly fond of that word. I like to take the word asava and then analyze it etymologically. Actually, I'll try my hand on the Chinese character too. If I make a mistake, please correct me. Is that correct? Right? Okay. Okay, the word asava comes from the root su, which means to flow. And then it has a prefix a, which usually indicates some direction. And there is difference of opinion what direction the a in asava is pointing to. Some say the a means out, and so they take asava to mean things that flow out. And so there was an old translation, going back maybe to the 1930s, outflows. Or some use maybe fancier, more contemporary word, effluence, things that flow out, flow away. But it seems to me that the prefix a, more generally has the sense of towards oneself. We're all right here. Okay. For example, gacchati means to go, agacchati means to come, harati means to take, aharati means to bring. So if we take a to mean in, then asava would mean things that flow in. We could say inflows or influxes. And the reason I put the Chinese character on the board is because it's quite helpful to indicate the way the translators, the early translators of Buddhist texts into Chinese, understood the word. Sometimes the Chinese character is almost a little commentary on the meaning of the word. The character has the water radical, that's on the left. This part is a stone, the main part of a character. A roof, that's even better. The roof. And then the part under the roof is the water, the rain, the character meaning rain. Right? Okay, so this suggests water leaking through a roof.
It's a house. That's a house.
Yeah, so it's part of the house, yeah. So water leaking into a house. So even it struck me that maybe a good rendering for asava would be leakages. Better than taints. But so that I don't confuse people, I'll probably continue to use taints when I explain this. But most often I will probably use the Pali word. Okay, so this sutta begins when the Buddha is living in Jeta's grove in Savatthi. He calls the attention of the monks, and then he speaks to them and he says, "Monks, I shall teach you a discourse on the restraint of all the taints. Listen and attend closely to what I shall say." Okay, the monks reply, "Yes." Then the Buddha starts to speak. And then he says, "Bhikkhus, monks, I say that the destruction of the taints is for one who knows and sees, not for one who does not know and does not see." And now we should notice immediately that there's a contrast between paragraph 2 and paragraph 3. In paragraph 2, the Buddha says he's going to give a discourse on the restraint of all the taints. Here the word is sangvara. Okay, so the Buddha introduces the discourse as having as its theme the restraint of all the taints. And now restraint has two aspects. The aspect of first keeping under control, and then the aspect of elimination or eradication. And so the destruction of the taints, we could say, is the culmination of a process that begins with restraining the taints. One has to start off by keeping the taints under control, preventing them from arising, preventing them from dominating one's thoughts, one's emotions, one's actions. And then one has to cultivate the systematic path of the Buddha in order to completely eliminate the taints, that is, through their destruction. Okay, first, what is it that we are speaking about when we use this word taints, influxes, leakages? The way I understand this word, I take it to mean, I use the expression, the primordial defilements that lie at the base of samsaric becoming, that lie at the root or base of the cycle of birth and death. Or maybe we can call them even the fundamental forces at the hub of the wheel of birth and death. So the Buddha teaches in the early discourses that there are 3 asavas, 3 taints. Okay, so these 3 taints are called in Pali Kamasava, Bhavasava, and Avijjasava. Kamasava is the taint or leakage of sensuality, of sensual desire, sensual craving. And this is identified as basically as the craving for sensual pleasures. Deeper and more fundamental than this is bhavasava. Literally it means the taint of existence, the taint of being. But what it actually points to is the taint of craving for existence, the craving for renewed existence. And this is the desire to go on existing as an individual being, and then this takes the form of the craving for eternal life, for personal immortality, or the craving to be reborn in a particular realm of existence in order to enjoy the happiness and bliss that supposedly are present within that realm. And then the 3rd asava is the taint or leakage of ignorance. And this means basically not understanding the real nature of things. Usually it's identified technically with not knowing, not seeing the 4 Noble Truths. Okay, later, texts from a somewhat later period, even beginning with the Abhidhamma, add a 4th asava. I put this in brackets because we don't find it in the early suttas. And this is called the dit asava. This is the asava of ditti, of views. And the way I would understand it, the dit asava are views which, when they are clung to, become a basis for sustaining the movement of the cycle of birth and death. Sometimes the question is asked, what is the relationship of the asavas to the 3 poisons or 3 unwholesome roots? Many people know about the 3 unwholesome roots. What are they? Right, greed, hatred, and delusion. The 2 are not identical, though there's a certain overlap. The unwholesome root of greed will correspond with the taint of sensuality and the taint of craving for existence. The unwholesome root of delusion will correspond to some extent with the taint of ignorance. But the unwholesome root of hatred or aversion, we don't find amongst the asavas. And this raises an interesting question, why? And I haven't found this point discussed in the texts themselves, so I just have come up with my own conjecture about the reason. The way I understand the exclusion of hatred from the asavas is because the asavas are intended to enumerate those factors that are responsible for driving the forward movement of samsara, the cycle of birth and death. Now, hatred, of course, is an unwholesome quality, and so to that extent, it sustains the movement of samsara. But it is not a factor that attaches one to the cycle of birth and death. Rather, it's a factor that motivates strong, unwholesome action that will bring miserable results in the future. But the movement of hatred is to turn away from or to destroy, whereas those qualities called asavas, sensuality, the craving for existence, and ignorance, and even the wrong view, their direction, their tendency is to become attached, to tie one to bind one to something. The actual word asava was used even before the time of the Buddha. It's not a word that the Buddha himself coined, but it was used among some of the other spiritual communities that preceded the rise of Buddhism. Particularly the Jains used the word asava, but with a somewhat different meaning than the word has in Buddhism. The Jains used it to mean the flowing in of karma. In their view, karma was a kind of material particle that entered into the soul whenever one performs unwholesome actions. And so this karma soils or taints the pure soul as a kind of dark material particle. The Buddha apparently took over the word asava in the sense of things that flow in, but he doesn't use it in relation to karma, but in relation to these basic defilements. And so the task of the spiritual life, according to the Buddha's teachings, is to eliminate completely the asavas. The asavas are the driving forces at the base of samsara. And so the task is to reach what is called the destruction of the asavas. That is asavakaya. Okay, so in this sutta, the Buddha is going to teach 7 methods of restraining the asavas. Of these 7 methods, 2 of them are concerned with eradicating or eliminating the asavas, and the other 5 methods will be concerned with restraining the asavas in the sense of keeping them under control, preventing them from arising and becoming stronger. Okay, so let us now go back into the discourse in paragraph 3. We see the Buddha says, I say that the destruction of the taints is for one who knows and sees, not for one who does not know and does not see. Then he asks, who knows and sees what? Okay, now the Buddha is going to explain 2 important qualities, opposed qualities, that are responsible, on the one hand, for the arising and strengthening of the taints, and on the other hand, for the weakening and elimination of the taints. These 2 opposed qualities are called, in Pali they're called yoniso manasikara and ayoniso manasikara. Here they're translated wise attention and unwise attention. But again, I like to go to the original words and then explain them based on the original. What is called wise attention is yoniso manasikara. So the word yoniso doesn't really mean wise, but it's an ablative. Well, not many people know what ablative is, except those who study polygram. Anyway, it's a form based on the word yoni, which has the meaning of origin, source. It also means the womb of a woman. And then yoniso gives the idea of from the origin, from the source. So the idea here seems to be that one goes to the source, to the fundamental origins of things, and then explores a particular issue, a particular matter, thoroughly, carefully, methodically. To say that one explores or investigates a particular matter accurately, meticulously, thoroughly. Then the opposite of that is ayoniso manasikara, which means that when one attends to something, one attends in a sloppy way, a careless way, a superficial way. Okay, so the Buddha says when one attends unwisely, unarisen taints arise and arisen taints increase. When one attends wisely, unarisen taints do not arise and arisen taints are abandoned. Okay, so this statement helps us to see what it is that keeps these asavas flowing. So it takes us even to a very fundamental level. If we want to eradicate, to eliminate the defilements, we have to understand what keeps them, what sustains them, what keeps them flowing and moving along. And then we have to know what to do from a practical point of view, what one has to do to keep them from arising and to abandon them. And the key to both issues lies in the way we direct our attention to our experience. So when we examine things, reflect, consider things in this superficial or careless way, that provides the condition, the opportunity for the taints to arise. It's what keeps ignorance flowing along. You know, in the formula of dependent origination, we trace the 12 links back to ignorance. Avijja paccaya sankhara. Depending on ignorance, the volitional activities arise. Dependent on volitional activities, consciousness, name and form, and so on. And so what keeps the ignorance intact is this habit or practice of attending carelessly, superficially, unmethodically to things. And since the whole process of liberation begins with the elimination of ignorance, then the question comes, how does one remove ignorance? Then the answer that this statement is suggesting is through wise attention, systematic, methodical attention. Okay, having introduced wise attention and unwise attention here, the Buddha changes track a little bit and introduces the 7 types, the 7 ways of eliminating the taints. He says there are taints that should be abandoned by seeing, taints that should be abandoned by restraining, taints that should be abandoned by using, taints that should be abandoned by enduring, taints that should be abandoned by avoiding, taints that should be abandoned by removing, and taints that should be abandoned by developing. Now, even though 7 methods are mentioned here, once we go through the discourse, we could see that these 7 methods can actually be put into 2 groups. One group comprises the methods that actually eliminate the taints, that abandon them completely so that they can't arise again. And this category includes 2 of these methods. Can anybody guess what they are? I said, of these 7 methods, 2 of the methods deal with the eradication or elimination of the taints. The other 5 are concerned with controlling or simply restraining the taints, preventing them from becoming stronger. 2 are concerned with the actual elimination of the taints.
Well, removing and maybe developing.
You got 1 right. Removing, maybe the word is a little deceptive there. More loudly? No. Oh, but you are masters. Okay, but you let the cat out of the bag. The first one is seeing. So seeing means seeing into the truth. And so with that seeing into the truth, one eliminates certain taints so that they can't arise in the future. And then developing, as we'll see, involves developing the seven enlightenment factors which culminate in the enlightenment by which one completely eradicates the taints. The middle five are concerned with restraining the taints. Okay, so now we'll come to the first section, the section on the taints to be abandoned by seeing. And this word that's translated as seeing has a somewhat technical meaning. If I'm putting too many Pali words on the board and if you think I'm overloading you with foreign terms, please complain to me. I don't want anybody to get discouraged thinking, boy, this guy just speaks in a foreign language and we can't relate it to our own ways of thinking. But sometimes it's useful to become acquainted with the precise meaning of these words and to see what they mean in their original context. It's useful to know what the Pali word is. Okay, so the word dasana here, which is what we translate as seeing, has the meaning, special meaning of the first seeing through, well, seeing always implies to direct cognition, to direct experience of the Four Noble Truths in their entirety. And this is a technical term for the initial breakthrough to the Dhamma, what's called the gaining of the eye of the Dhamma. And this refers to attaining the stage of Sotapatti, the stage of stream entry, whereby the truth of the Dhamma opens up to one's inner vision and one sees directly the Four Noble Truths. Then once one acquires that vision of the truths, one has to develop that vision through continued practice. The attainment of this vision of the truths, the seeing of the truths, is not liberation yet, but it is the opening up of the path to liberation, so that one steps onto the path and is assured of ultimate realization, ultimate liberation. One can never revert back from the path, but one has to continue to develop the vision, to develop the qualities of the Noble Eightfold Path until they ripen in full enlightenment, full realization. And so technically, we say that the attainment of seeing means reaching the first stage of enlightenment, and then the practice of development means that one develops this vision to the second, third stages, onto the path to the fourth stage, the stage of arhatship. Though in order to arrive at that experience of seeing, one has to develop the path in the preliminary stage as well. Okay, so now the Buddha speaks about taints to be abandoned by seeing. And so he raises the question, what taints should be abandoned by seeing? Then he's going to illustrate this by taking the specific case of what is called the untaught ordinary person, or sometimes translated the uninstructed worldling. Because this is an ordinary person, a person without any degree of realization, direct understanding of truth, who has no regard for the noble ones. He doesn't have any special respect or reverence for the noble persons. He is unskilled in their teaching, in their Dhamma. That is, doesn't have knowledge of their teaching, and he's undisciplined in their Dhamma. That is, he is not trained in the practice that pertains to their teaching. Okay, then he has no regard for the true men. The true men is the same as the noble ones. And he's unskilled and undisciplined in their Dhamma. This person does not understand what things are fit for attention and what things are unfit for attention. Since that is so, he attends to those things unfit for attention, and he does not attend to those things that are fit for attention. Now, the commentary to the sutta makes a very interesting and important point in this connection. It explains that actually there are no things that are exclusively fit for attention and no things that are exclusively unfit for attention. The difference doesn't consist in the things themselves, but in the way one attends to them. So we could take the same things that are ordinarily considered unfit for attention, and if we apply to them skillful attention, then they can become, or wise attention, then they can become a basis for the positive development of the mind. For example, within the context of the monk's life, excuse me, but it's usually considered the form of a beautiful woman is something unfit for attention, in the sense that if one attends unwisely to the form of the woman, then sensual craving is going to arise. And then that will bring trouble to the mind. And in the case of some monks, they might want to leave the monastic life and return to the household life. Okay, but if one knows the proper way of attention, then one could take even the form of the most beautiful bathing beauties, Miss Universe, Miss America, whatever, and one applies what's called the asubha sanya, the perception of the unattractive nature of the body, and one starts penetrating. Well, first one could even examine the parts of the body close up, hair of the head. You just cut off some of that beautiful hair, spread it out on the table, look at it. Will you fall in love with that beautiful hair? Or one maybe shaves off some of the hair under the arms, puts it on the table. Is it really lovely and beautiful? She cuts her fingernails, takes the fingernails, puts them on the table. Maybe the dentist pulls out a tooth. You go to the dentist and say, "Can I have that tooth?" Or some of her flakes of the skin peel off. If you get sunburned, the skin peels off. Put it down. So we have some head hairs, body hairs, fingernails, a tooth, and peelings of the skin. Beautiful or not? And then one starts. If one is a surgeon, one looks into the body, performs the operation. There's beneath that beautiful skin, there's just muscle, nerves, bones, kidneys, heart, the liver, lungs, and so on. So putting this all together, there's nothing there that's very beautiful. Okay, so if we attend to these things that are normally considered unfit for attention, then they can become a means for reducing the asadas, reducing these taints. Okay, so now the Buddha raises the question, what are the things unfit for attention that he attends to? Okay, they are things such that when he attends to them, the unarisen taint of sensual desire arises in him, and the arisen taint of sensual desire increases. The arisen taint of being, this is craving for continued existence, continued individuality, arises in him, and the arisen taint of being increases. The unarisen taint of ignorance arises, and the arisen taint of ignorance increases. Those are the things unfit for attention that he attends to. Okay, then what are the things fit for attention that he does not attend to? They are things such that when he attends to them, the unarisen taint of sensual desire does not arise, and the arisen taint of sensual desire is abandoned. The arisen taint of craving for existence does not arise, and the arisen taint of craving for existence is abandoned. The unarisen taint of ignorance does not arise, and the arisen taint of ignorance is abandoned. These are the things fit for attention that he does not attend to. By attending to things unfit for attention, by not attending to things fit for attention, unarisen taints arise and arisen taints increase. Okay, so if we take the commentarial explanation, what is meant by the attending to things that one should not attend to means that one attends to things, anything, in terms of what are called the distorted modes of attention. And these, according to the Buddha's teaching, are of four types. They're attending to what is unattractive, not beautiful, attending to it as beautiful. I gave the example of attending to the body, the physical body, which if one looks at it analytically, it's not beautiful, not attractive, but if one grasps the impression of the whole, it appears beautiful, and then one becomes attached to it, and this can cause the craving for sensual enjoyment to arise. Then becoming attached or attending to what is impermanent as permanent. And so this will apply, it can apply to anything, but it can apply specifically to certain deep states of tranquility meditation, in which one experiences a state of either radiant bliss, deep peacefulness, and one could then take this to be a disclosure, a contact with some kind of permanent, everlasting state of existence. But if one contemplates this peaceful or blissful state methodically with wise attention, one will see that this state is impermanent. It arises when one makes the appropriate effort, when one sustains one's attention on it, when one turns the attention away, when one relaxes that effort, that state subsides and ends. And so one sees the impermanent as being, in that case, as being impermanent. The third distorted way of understanding or distorted way of attention is attending to what is really dukkha, unsatisfactory, unsatisfying, as being blissful or a source of happiness. Again, this could apply to either sensual pleasures. One takes the sensual pleasures to be really a source of bliss and sustainable happiness. But if one attends wisely to the sensual pleasures, one sees that these sensual pleasures are impermanent. Because they're impermanent, they're not really satisfactory. One sees how to attain the sensual pleasures, one has to go through a lot of trouble and turmoil. While one is enjoying them, the mind is accompanied by some degree of anxiety and clinging. And if one loses them, then one falls into misery, dejection, even despair. And this wrong attention can apply as well to these blissful meditative states. Again, if one takes them to be permanent, one also takes them to be blissful, truly stable and secure. But if one attends to them as being through their impermanence, then one sees that they're ultimately dukkha, unsatisfactory, inadequate, or flawed. And then the fourth unwise mode of attention is attending to what is really not self, not a true I, as being my real self, my true I. So this is basically, it's the view of Sakkaya Ditthi, the view of a substantial self existing in any way in regard to the five aggregates. And so when one identifies, whether it be the body, feelings, perceptions, volitional activities, or consciousness as being myself, the property of myself, that way of attention arises from ignorance, and it contributes to the sustaining of all of these taints. It sort of feeds back into the underlying ignorance, reinforces that ignorance, reinforces the craving for continued existence. Even to some extent, it can reinforce the craving for sensual pleasures. Okay, so those are the things let us say these are the unwise modes of attention which he applies to when he attends to anything. And attending in this way will cause unarisen taints to arise and arisen taints to increase and become stronger. Okay, maybe I'll pause at this point and then ask whether there are any questions. Okay, please, what is your name? Martha?
Martha, with G. M-A-G-D-A, Martha.
M-A?
Like Magdalena, Martha.
M-A-G-A? D-A. Magda. Magda. Like the... Magdalena, okay. Okay.
The last four that you mentioned,
Yeah.
it seems like it's all just one, which is the attachment of the impermanent as person. Like all four of them fall under that category.
Let us say that the first one is somewhat distinct. This is the way of attending to the unattractive as if it were attractive. Now, the mode of attending to the impermanent as if it were permanent, this becomes, let us say, the impermanence, the mark of impermanence is actually the foundation for the other two characteristics. Of course, there are some things which are actually clearly and definitely painful and the source of misery. So that doesn't depend upon impermanence. But things that are pleasurable and enjoyable, we normally regard as being pleasant and enjoyable. But if we look at these things from the standpoint of their impermanence, then we could see that they are unsatisfactory. And so this is another implication of the Pali word dukkha. Dukkha means literally pain or suffering, but it has this broader meaning of what is unsatisfactory, what is inadequate, what is defective, and everything becomes defective. Everything impermanent is defective because of its impermanence. And so impermanence will lead into the mark of unsatisfactoriness, and then also impermanence leads into the mark of selflessness, because these 5 aggregates, which we'll explain them in greater length later, but the body, feelings, perceptions, volitions, consciousness, they're all impermanent. Because they're impermanent, they can't be taken as a substantial self. And so the mark of non-self follows from the mark of impermanence. But there's still somewhat different ways of viewing things. Did somebody else have a question? Please.
I don't know if I heard you right, but the difference between the asavas and the unwholesome roots, did you say something about karma? One dealt with karma and one didn't?
Yeah, what I said is that the unwholesome roots, greed, hatred, and delusion, are mentioned specifically as the roots of unwholesome actions. So those are the factors that create unwholesome karma. The asavas are not so specifically, to my recollection, not so specifically connected with karma. Of course, naturally they will create actions born from these asavas will create karma, but the way they function in the teaching, they're not so explicitly connected with karma, to my recollection. Please. Your name again is?
Katie.
Katie, right.
I don't normally use the word influx.
Yeah.
So, and I don't have a dictionary with me, but I'm wondering if influence would be, that's something that just resonates a little more. And then this related question is, when you said the primordial source of the taints, that resonated a little bit in the concept of sin, and I'm wondering if there's a sense of, there's a clear distinction that this isn't something that resides, for lack of a better term, within the person. It's influences that are outside that could defile someone.
Okay. This is something we go through every Saturday. It seems during the week that they just hit the bell a few times and finish. But on Saturday when we're having the class, it seems interminable, the ringing of the bell. Is it just my impression, or my personal impression, or do you sense that too? Okay, that's a good question. Actually, 2 good questions. Some translators have actually used the word influence as a rendering for asava, and so it's a possibility. The only reason, and it agrees with the literal meaning of the word, though in English the word influence has lost its connection to its etymological origins, but influence comes from fluence is flowing, and in means, of course, in. So it's flowing in. What flows in is an influence. But I don't like to use influence because asavas are considered things which are always unwholesome, whereas influences can be good and bad. Okay, then your second question, whether it corresponds to the idea of sin. First, in Buddhism, we don't have a term that, to my mind, brings along the specific connotations of the idea of sin in Christianity, of some kind of original corruption, a moral corruption. The asavas, as well as the other qualities like the unwholesome roots, are usually viewed purely as psychological factors, mental factors. They're mental factors responsible for bondage and suffering, but they don't have that weight of that sense of being evil, much less do they suggest something like the idea of sin. I think the original meaning is separation, with the idea that it is what brings about a separation from God. So the asavas don't have that sense. But I do, in my understanding, the asavas should be understood as things that I take it to mean things that flow into active consciousness from the deep recesses of the mind. Now, this is my own understanding, that the word is not actually analyzed or explained in that way in the Buddhist texts themselves. In fact, no explanation of the word is given, no derivation of the word is given within the Sutta texts.
I have a simple question, etymological. What does Sabbāsava mean?
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, Sabbāsava is just, Sabba is all. So it's all plus asava. That's why it's called Sabbāsava Sutta, discourse on all the taints. Okay, I should have explained that. Any further questions? Okay, so we'll end now, and then we have, after lunch, we have at 12 o'clock, we have a little discussion period. So if anybody likes to come back for further discussion, then we'll meet back here at 12 o'clock. Okay, so we'll end with the sharing of the merits. And so we want to share these merits with other beings. When we speak on Dhamma, listen to Dhamma, discuss Dhamma, we get what is called some kind of wholesome karma. We call this merit. And in Buddhism, we don't keep this merit to ourselves, like accumulation in a bank account, but we use it to share with other beings. And so we think first of what are called the Dhamma-protecting deities, and we share the merit with them. You could think of any departed relatives and friends, relatives or friends, as well as all beings in general. And so we send out these merits with the hope, especially that the Dhamma-protecting deities will protect the Buddha's teachings, protect the world, protect ourselves and others. Okay, so I'll recite using verses in Pali. And okay, next time I'll recite now, but next time you could distribute the sheets with the verses. So just think with loving kindness of the Dhamma-protecting deities, any departed beings, friends or relatives, and all beings in general. Akasata ca bhumata devanaga mahidika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu sasanam. Akasata ca bhumata devanaga mahidika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu desanam. Akasata ca bhumata devanaga mahidika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu mang parang. Etavata ca amhehi Sampadang punya sampadang sabbe devanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya etavata cha amhehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe bhutanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya etavata cha amhehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe sadanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya bhavagupadaya avicihetato etantare satakayupapanna rupiya rupicha asanya sanino dukkha pamuchantu pusantu nibbutting.